friend and wonderful scholar and journalist all around, Ann Nelson. Ann wears many hats. She is an award-winning investigative journalist. She is an author. She is a playwright. She is a former professor and the former director of the international program at the Columbia School of Journalism. Anne is the recipient of many grants and awards, and I'm not going to read them all. She's won a Guggenheim, and she has won the Livingston Award for her reporting on the Philippines. The book about which she'll be talking to us, and I guess adapting it to the present moment, is her latest, called Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. It was published in 2019, and as Anne just said, she already needs to add quite a lot to it to make it relevant for this year. So Anne, welcome.
Thank you so much. Is the sound good? Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Perfect, perfect. Well, it's a real pleasure. I'm a big fan of the Rifkind Center and the work that Mikhail Deckel has been doing. And I won't be the first person to say that we're in a critical moment in the history of the United States and the history of democracy in the Western world. So I will talk about the research I've been doing over the last 3 years. As Mikhail said, I come from a very interdisciplinary background. I was a journalist who covered many conflicts in the developing world, and I lived under authoritarian regimes in that case. So I've had that life experience, which influences my thinking. I've taught journalism, and in recent years, I've been writing history. And I should also note that I grew up in Oklahoma, but I've been living on the East Coast for my adult life. But I go back and forth between these two regions, which gives me a different perspective on American politics than a lot of people have. So what I'm talking about today is the way that political communications have changed radically in ways that help to bring Trump to power and have helped to exaggerate an imbalance in our political system, and in many ways to undermine democratic processes and the rule of law. That happened because there were some defects built into the system from the beginning in our very Constitution, where you had states that were based on the power imbued in slave owners with large plantations and a view of democracy based on property, versus the more heavily populated northern states where one man, one vote was more of an ethos. And the Constitution that we've lived under has been an uneasy compromise between those two. In recent years, there's been a way of exploiting the defects in that system through a combination of political strategy developed over a long time, and also from the application of new technologies, which allow certain interests to widen the gap. I'm going to present some slides to illustrate how that's happened, and I will see here how slide share goes. And yes. So let's start out by talking about how our political system actually works. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, a sizable advantage. Trump won the Electoral College by fewer than 100,000 votes in 3 states: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So 100,000 overruled the political will of the 3 million plurality. That is essential to remember, and this is a system that we're still living under. So one of the questions was, how exactly did that happen? And one of the answers is a lot of oversight on the part of the Democrats. Wisconsin, one of the swing states, was the biggest issue. Hillary Clinton did not even campaign in Wisconsin. And when I went to speak at the Wisconsin Book Festival, the local Democrats told me that the National Party didn't even deliver campaign literature for them to hand out door to door because they took it for granted. And I would say that as a thesis, the Democrats have concentrated on their strong points. And if you see these blue states, they're the coastal states, they're heavily populated, Boston, New York, Washington corridor, West Coast. And they've overlooked and neglected and sometimes derided the states in the middle, which are sometimes called the flyover states, which is insulting. And I say that as a native of a flyover state. So it's a little counterintuitive to insult voters and then expect them to vote for you. And because the Democrats have been so focused on the demographics that work in their favor, they've overlooked how the Electoral College has worked against them. Now, if you look at the demographics of the United States, we're becoming ever more diverse. We're becoming less religious. We're becoming less white. And the Democrats have been stressing that in their campaign platforms for a while now. And in terms of the next 20 years, they're absolutely right. In terms of the Electoral College, it hasn't always worked that way. And one thing to keep in mind is that in these swing states, you have a cohort of voters who are over 50, who are white, who are rural and suburban and live in low density population areas. And they turn out to vote in many cases at a rate of over 90%. That is absolutely key in this picture. On the other hand, if you look at the demographics of the Democrats' target audience in a lot of their messaging, African American, millennials, etc., you have a much lower turnout rate. And you don't have them scattered across the swing states in the same way. So if you look at, I'm trying to see here how, the voters in the blue areas, or the Democrats, are again filtered out through these coastal and urban areas. And in a lot of states in the Midwest, you'll see little tiny islands of blue in a large sea of red. So that's where you have to focus in terms of how the Electoral College works. And the critical areas are often the light pink and the light blue, which are the swing districts. And a lot of these are the suburban, largely white voters who are in the tiny margin of voters who are not decided at the outset on their political party. So here we have the map as it has been for much of 2020. And you see the 6 critical swing states for the Electoral College. The brown states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania again in the north, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona in the south. Now, these are not the only swing states, but these are the ones with double-digit Electoral College representatives. So they will have an outsized role in determining the future of the United States. And because climate is such an incredible critical issue, I would say a great deal to do with the future of the world. So how do political communications work at this point? Let's look at the media. You've got several things going on. You've got the whole culture of memes and one-liners for what might be low information voters. And you've got direct address of the candidate trying to communicate to supporters. And I taught this course called New Media Development Communication at Columbia for 7 years. And I always started out saying, there is nothing new under the sun. Digital media doesn't create anything. It's a catalyst. It makes it faster, it makes it broader, it tweaks it. So we're dealing with political culture that goes back to the Revolutionary War. And then you've also got political communications where you have a candidate who's trying to address a particular audience, and he may tailor his message according to who the listeners are. So if Lincoln's giving the Gettysburg Address, and he's got a lot of people involved in the war, veterans and families listening to him, his his remarks will be tailored to their interests and their emotions. But if he's giving an address or a private meeting to bankers, it might be a different address. And we see that throughout political history. So what's happened in our area? Well, if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, there was a news pyramid. And it started with the Associated Press, which was a collective of all of the major newspapers in the United States, very professional. They fed their own news into the central office. It packaged it and sent it back out. They had their own highly professional reporters. So when I was growing up in Oklahoma and reading my hometown newspaper, the front page stories would have matched the front page stories of the major media to a high degree. And within this pyramid, you have the news stories starting at the top with the AP, the New York Times, the prestigious newspapers, and the same presentation of facts would largely filter down through the news magazines and the television network news divisions, the regional news media, and ultimately to the local newspapers and to the local radio stations. So I'm not saying that everybody agreed about the Vietnam War. They didn't. But if the report said there was a battle on October 12th, they would be largely in agreement that there was a battle, there were casualties, and that it was important enough to report. What we have now is a disruption of that system in a massive scale. And this has been going on for over 20 years. And of course, it starts with the digital disruption where technology removes the business model from local newspapers by taking advertising revenue. And something similar has been happening in terms of audiences moving away from network news. So your whole news pyramid has been broken up. And you have a lot of these communities represented by the dots where there may be no newspaper that reports news in an entire county, right? And you also have a situation where local television stations have been acquired by groups like Sinclair, which put their own stamp on news, which is less professional in terms of journalism. You also have this eruption of cable news and cable television, and its revenue model is based on building anxiety for the left and for the right. You also have an entire universe of religious broadcasters who have moved into this vacuum, and that includes television and radio. So my book, Shadow Network, deals with a group called the Council for National Policy. It's a networking organization of the radical right, and they were established by Christian fundamentalists and by big oil interests in 1981. And they've really spent the last 40 years in developing a long-term strategy to benefit from the disruptions in the journalism industry by plowing big money from the oil interests and the DeVos family of Michigan, the family that Betsy DeVos married into. And I argue that they have undertaken a really strategic approach to undermining our architecture of knowledge. So they have broadcasters that mimic the practices of news in terms of design. They have somebody called an anchorman sitting at a desk, and they have chyrons, and it looks like TV news to the untrained eye. But then there's none of the professional journalistic practice where you interview multiple sources, you have editors, you have fact checkers, you have lawyers, you have all kinds of underlying professional practice in journalism that creates a story that is attempting to inform the public. And instead, what you have is a media system that relies on unidirectional messaging built on marketing principles, where the top, or the big donors, determine what the message should be and what effect they want. And then the strategists and the marketers and the media people play it out to the public. So if you're living on the East Coast or the West Coast, you probably have access to a lot of news organizations and a culture that relies on fact-based information. You are probably more tied into educational institutions and universities. You are tied more into a belief in science. And all of those institutions are fairly robust in a lot of the country. But in the middle of the country, you have this multi-pronged attack on these institutions. You have Republican governors that have taken funding away from state universities, and a lot of them have been totally gutted. You have Betsy DeVos trying to undermine public schools and taking funding away from public education in order to channel it towards fundamentalist religious schools and homeschooling that will not expose the students to critical thinking. Then you have this assault not only on science, not only on professional medicine and medical research, but also on the journalism that helps orient people to what's going on in their world. So this makes a cohort of previously unengaged voters ripe for this kind of messaging. And one of the people who's been key in this process at the Council for National Policy is Ralph Reed. He's been around for a very long time. He's been around for decades, even though he continues to look about 12 years old. And what this group had done was, over the years, tried to bring their resources to different Republican candidates, starting with Ronald Reagan, and say, we've got a lot of voters in our pocket. We have a lot of influence with these people. And if you will help us, we'll help you. They had their hearts broken time and time again. Reagan was willing and eager to accept their help, but he didn't always follow his script once he was in office. I think they felt betrayed by George W. Bush, because Bush went out and courted them and claimed that he was born again. But at heart, he was a Connecticut Episcopalian, and that's what he reverted to. And he did not put the fundamentalists in the offices that they hoped for. He was not consistent about playing out their policies. So the story that I discuss in Shadow Network is how they keep going back to these candidates time and time again. And it was only in 2016, when they approached Donald Trump, that they got the deal that they thought they deserved. In June 2016, they had a summit with Donald Trump. They brought in 1,000 fundamentalist voters and leaders from these communities, and had a summit in New York City on Times Square at the Marriott Marquis Hotel. And the deal was struck where the fundamentalists and the Council for National Policy said, we've got money, and we've got our media, and we've got ground troops to go and canvass, and we've also got a digital operation. And we will bring these to you in return for our demands. And their demands were, first, that their organizations would be able to nominate federal judges in order to implement their policies moving into the future. The organizations that were run by members of the Council for National Policy were the Federalist Society, the second was the Heritage Foundation, and the third was the National Rifle Association. And indeed, when Trump came into office, these three organizations presented a list of acceptable judges, which Trump has abided by. Their second ask was for Trump to create an evangelical advisory committee. A third of the people on his committee are members of the Council for National Policy. So that's another area where Trump and their machinery can work in perfect harmony. The third area that they wanted was for Trump to ditch his preferred vice presidential running mate, Chris Christie, and put in the Council for National Policy's favorite, Mike Pence. And that indeed happened shortly after the summit in 2016. So here we've got Trump, who is not a representative, is not a lifelong member of this fundamentalist club, but those of us who are in New York and have watched Trump over the years were rather startled to see him turn on a dime and go from the gilded playboy of Fifth Avenue to this guy being prayed over by legions of fundamentalists. And there was no easy way to explain this conversion experience unless you look at this movement. And again, in terms of the swing state, over 80% of the cohort that Ralph Reed and his associates identified voted for Trump even though many of them had been never Trumpers moving into the election. So one of the ways that they achieve this is through a very sophisticated operation that assembles data from church directories provided by pastors who are members of organizations that work within this unit. The data indicates who's in the congregation. That is matched against voter files. So you know who is registered as a Democrat or Republican, who is a regular voter, and then they combine all of this and figure out which people in these churches, and we're talking about tens of thousands of churches, tens of thousands across the country, concentrated in the middle. And they have ways of encouraging those who are going to vote for Republican to get to the polls. They provide them with transportation and encouragement and bombard them with text messages. They don't encourage the Democrats to go to the polls. And in the meantime, they are governed under, officially governed at least, IRS tax regulations. So they do distribute politically oriented material in the churches. Tens of thousands of churches, the voter guides. And what these organizations do is say, well, we're not urging you to support one candidate over another. You might remember Judge Roy Moore, who was running for Senate in Alabama. This is how they would present the case. Does Roy Moore support the homosexual agenda, whatever that is? No, he does not. Does his Democratic opponent? Yes, he supports the homosexual agenda, right? So they say, oh, we're not endorsing anybody, but they're presenting the information in such a way that people reach their conclusions fairly easily. And these voter guides are inserted in the church bulletin, right? So you get your bulletin, you open it up, here's your hymn, here's your sermon, here's how to vote. They project videos in the church sanctuary. They provide an entire website that I've looked at, which provides pastors with entire sermons that they can download. And again, what they're trying to do is focus the election on their issues, on single issues as they frame them. Now, interestingly enough, if you go back to the 1960s and 70s, you don't have cases where abortion is a huge issue, nor do you have the fundamentalists hugely diverging from public opinion on abortion. So it took them really something like 20 years to find a way to frame the abortion question in such a way that it was so emotional and shocking that they could get these voters' attentions. And in my book, I describe one of the people who was working with the focus groups and describing how they hit upon the term partial birth abortion, right? That was a big breakthrough for them because, as he says, it evokes such horrific images in the mind of the listener that how can you possibly support anything like that? Now, of course, partial birth abortion does not exist. It is not a medical term. And what they're trying to do with all of their information is persuade the voters that Democrats support something called abortion on demand up to the day of birth. So thanks to my research, I have been deluged with their mailings, and that's exactly what they say. Again, this does not exist. This is not a phenomenon, and no Democrat supports it. It's tragic because a lot of people actually believe it exists, and it's been one of the horribly divisive issues in this country that is built around a fantasy. So here we have this played out in very vivid and visceral ways through communication systems that are not visible in most cases to the professional news media, to academia. A lot of people are not looking at what's going on in the sanctuaries of these fundamentalist churches in Arkansas, but it's also being replicated across many media platforms, and it does have an impact on the vote. So as I said, a lot of this information and a lot of this messaging is built on data. That's one of the big differences in what's going on today compared to what went on a few decades ago. I think you can really start this story in 2008. And that was the point when Obama's team really jumped into social media as a political tool. And they were very advanced for the time. A lot of it was just using Facebook analytics to find prospective voters and then linking that information to their phone banks. And it was quite effective, and it was also highly contrasted with John McCain's campaign. McCain famously admitted that he wasn't sure how to use email. And so the Democrats were really quite advanced and quite far ahead in their use of this. So that provoked a reaction. As I said, the Council for National Policy and its related organizations are rooted in fundamentalist Christian groups and oil interests. And in 2015, the Koch brothers jumped in with both feet. And they were quite upset about Obama because of his economic policies and taxation, and as well as environmental policy. The Koch brothers' oil operations really did not benefit from controls on toxic waste dumps, on oil spills. It cut into their profits, and they had a strong libertarian wish that their profits not be interfered with for any reason in any way. They were not conservative on social issues. On the contrary, as libertarians, they didn't really care about abortion or LGBTQ issues. They were very laissez-faire on those issues, but they did find at this juncture that they needed the fundamentalists because they had some of the media networks and the organizations that could implement their policies. So it was a marriage of convenience. The Koch brothers spent $50 million that year, 50, on creating a state-of-the-art political data platform. It was called I360, and it's still in operation. And the big new idea on this was, first of all, it worked with Cambridge Analytica to acquire data on virtually every adult voter in the United States. But whereas previous data operations had looked primarily at political activity, whether you voted and who you were registered with and so on, this operation would go to Netflix and see what you watched on television. It would go to Amazon and see what books you bought. They even were able to access your cholesterol level, because guess what? Your cholesterol is actually a useful indicator on how you're going to vote. So you have this massive, massive data operation that is put together in 2010 and implemented as of 2015. And you also have it linked to a new generation of cell phone apps developed by a group called UCampaign. And what these apps did was to use the data to reach and energize and engage voters. The other thing that was quite new and is still innovative is making this data available to door-to-door canvassers. So let me say for a moment how that works. Let's say that you're in Missouri and you're a Democratic canvasser and you're working one side of the street. And as of 2018, you would have had a piece of paper with the names of and addresses of people on the street. It may have been out of date, probably was. And you would have known before you rang the doorbell, the name, the address, whether they were a registered voter, what party they were registered for, and what election they last voted for. So that was your information. If you were on the other side of the street as a Republican canvasser working for a candidate approved by the Koch brothers, you would have known that the person answering the door was a Catholic housewife with 6 children, and that she just bought an anti-abortion video on Amazon, and that she had just given money. So you knew exactly what issue to target. And not only that, your cell phone canvassing app gave you the script to read to that housewife based on a massive amount of knowledge that you had about her before you even knock on the door. The person next door to her could be a cranky old man with a rifle who had a home invasion last year, so you give him the NRA pitch. Totally different. So go door by door and you activate these fears and anxieties of the voters in a highly personalized way. So in 2020, this app and this linkage of the data to the app was taken to the next level. Brad Parscale announced that this app was coming last December, and it was made available a couple of months ago. Now, the problem, obviously, was that it was supposed to be launched about the time that the COVID crisis hit. And that has created a subterranean phenomenon in our political life and our public health that I'm going to talk about. They had a lot resting on this app because, unlike other apps, in order to download it, the user had to provide all of their contact information. And it also had a geolocation function. The way that works is that there are small devices called beacons, which are placed at in certain areas, very certainly at political rallies that are live rallies. So the beacon communicates with the cell phones that have downloaded the app, and then utilizes that information and leverages it to reach out to wider circles and to use the app to personalize the information. I've just learned this week that they also were embedding these beacons in Trump-Pence yard signs. So the yard signs would be gathering data from the cell phones of the person who put the yard sign in their yard. They combine it with consumer data, and then they roll it out to have highly personalized intensive voter outreach before the election. So this is going to be rolling across the swing states like nobody's business over the next few weeks. I mean, it's already begun. And let's think about it for a minute about what that might mean. One of the things that these apps do is access the entire contact list, the cell phone directory. And so it's then able to send messages to contacts in the person's phone. Now, I will say that the Biden campaign has an app, but its privacy regulations and its transparency are really quite different from this. And if you're interested in this area of campaign technology, which I think is incredibly important, I published an article about it in the Daily Beast. There's an excellent article about it in the New Yorker by Sue Halpern, and another in the MIT Technology Review. This approach to campaigning is happening. I mean, it's happening in real time. I don't think a lot of people understand it very well. Part of the problem is that so much of the coverage has been in the tech press, and if you're not reading Wired and the Technology Review, you may not understand it or even be aware of it. So I wish that there could be a better marriage of the traditional campaign coverage that you have in professional news organizations and the tech coverage, because it has been married in political campaigns in real time, and it's affecting our political life. So as you recall, the beacons rely on gathering data from real life events. You have to be within a certain distance of the beacon for it to serve its function. Now, you'll recall that last March, as this app was supposed to be rolling out, all of a sudden, Donald Trump is saying, we have to reopen everything by Easter. We have to have people in churches at Easter. Easter was like this magic time. And then moving on, well, we have to have rallies. We have to have actual rallies in person when all of the public health authorities and Dr. Fauci, the CDC, everyone you can think of was saying, not a good idea to have in-person rallies right now, right? You had this digital technology campaign imperative to get people in the room. And so that's what you had going on with the rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I lament to say, as an Oklahoman, that right now, in the ripples after that live event, Oklahoma has one of the highest rates of COVID in the country right now. And it started right on schedule after the Tulsa rally, getting 6,000 people into that room, and has rippled out to the rest of the state. So let's talk about how they position the issues. What I like to say about the strategy is that Democrats tend to come out of a culture of professional journalism and law. So they're really good at debating each other. And I think that they try to work within the marketplace of ideas and say, my idea is better than your idea, and I'm going to attack you on your idea, my plan, my policy. And they can get lost in the factual weeds, but a lot of times they depend on the factual weeds. So if they are people who went to law school and went to journalism school and are influenced by that culture, on the other side, the GOP of the radical right and their alternate media system work from a different premise. They work and think like people who went to business school and studied marketing. So if you have advertising going on, you don't say, well, here's 5 brands of soap. Let's discuss which one is the best. You say, this is our soap, and this is all you're going to hear about, and all you're going to hear is about how terrible the other soap is. So that's what you have in their entire culture and the way they organize their activities and their messaging and their operations. So what you have right now is an attempt to play Black Lives Matter as a movement. Well, they will call it terrorist in their memes. They will claim that it is going to destroy suburban, peaceful civic life. And they will cherry pick images of violence, video of violence, and project it as the meaning of Black Lives Matter. And sometimes these are actual events and it's actual footage from places like Portland, but it's not necessarily true. There was an image that became a meme of 2 very bloodied up police officers that was presented recently. Turned out that these police officers were beaten up a few years ago in Australia, right? But they use the images because the images work, and then they put the caption that they like on it. Abortion and so-called birthday abortions remains a big selling point that they're trying to use, even though they have totally distorted the facts around the debate. The need to reopen the economy. So far, in terms of polling, the economy has been Trump's strongest suit. But if it continues to close, especially in swing states, and especially in the South, where there are electoral votes he badly needs, this will damage his campaign. So what we see is the attempt to reopen the economy based on a number of excuses and arguments that utterly disregard the guidance from the CDC and the information that we're getting about the spread of the virus. There's a very great effort to paint the Democrats as anti-Christian, socialist, and communist. Again, anybody who's followed the career of Joe Biden over the years, or Kamala Harris, has to shake their head about this depiction. But when you're dealing with these voters, many of whom are what we call low information voters, what they see is the meme, not the reporting that would actually address the facts. So here you've got one of their operations. This is how they present Black Lives Matter. And when you have the network of their media systems, this stuff goes out to millions of people through email listserv, but you also see that there's radio, there's podcasts, there's television, and the online video reaches millions of people. This is the image that you would see if you were thinking about Black Lives Matter. Interestingly enough, as I heard a presentation on polling yesterday, and it doesn't seem to be registering as well as they've hoped. When they poll voters in suburbs and say, "Do you feel unsafe?" And we poll these swing voters, you know, in your daily life, do you feel threatened? Most of them don't. They just see these faraway images and they're told that, oh, New York City is a sea of anarchy, right? So if they're living within this alternate media universe, that's what they're told. They may not see anything that contradicts it, but it's not necessarily going to affect them psychologically as much as COVID, where it may be in their community. They may know somebody who actually has it. And this is representing kind of an uphill struggle for the Republicans. And I don't even know how to add in the information about Donald Trump and his wife today. We may get to that later. Here is a way that you see that this information is filtered out, often with the same language, right? You have it replicated and sent out and turned into memes and spread across social media platforms. Sometimes using exactly the same image, again, sometimes using exactly the same language, the same story. So whereas as a journalist, you bend over backwards not to have the same wording as your competitor, because you know you're reporting the story yourself, you're trying to get it right. In this case, think of it more like the soap ad, right? You're selling soap, you use the same slogan across all of your advertising platforms, and it reinforces the advertising message of whatever you're trying to sell. So you also have, beyond these pseudo news operations, the memes. And one thing that's been especially interesting and troublesome to me is that at the same time these operations are going after fearful, defensive, white fundamentalist votes, they've also had a parallel operation to depress the African American vote in the swing states. There's research that is very, very interesting and very concerning from 2016 that indicated that a lot of African Americans get information from Instagram. So there was an absolute barrage of messaging that went out to African American voters in swing states on Instagram that was designed to make them not go to the polls and vote for Democrats the way that they traditionally had. You know, you have patterns that go on for generations. And if you're an African American in Milwaukee, your tradition is going to be voting Democrat. Well, one of the messaging campaigns in 2016 was to tell them to go ahead and vote, but because Hillary Clinton was the person who put out the super predator message, they should only vote down the ticket, right? They should not vote for president at all. And lo and behold, when the results were counted in Wisconsin, you had 90,000 votes in Wisconsin that were cast without voting for president. Highly unusual, right? And at the end of the day, the difference that lost Wisconsin for the Democrats was something like 10,000 votes. So does it have an effect? I would say yes, it definitely has an influence. And you have this image, which is circulating now, which is going after the same effect. So recently, as in like this week, we've had two major stories come out which have documented the techniques that I'm talking about. There is a very important video that I hope everyone will take a chance to watch. It's 20 minutes, and it was created by Channel 4 in Great Britain, which is showing how Cambridge Analytica data was used to identify African-American voters in Milwaukee in 2016 and use it to depress their vote, or they called it deterrence. They were put in a category of being African-American voters, probable Democrats, and there was a deterrence campaign that was unleashed on them from all of these media, multi-platform. And in a lot of cases, it was successful. When I was in Wisconsin, I spoke to a gentleman who said, yeah, I couldn't vote for Hillary because of what I was seeing about her, and so I just went and voted for everything else. This thing actually happened. And the Channel 4 news item interviews the people in question and shows how it worked, how the blocks were identified, and how the specific households and individuals and how their personal data was implemented to figure out how to influence them to not support the Democrat that would have helped put Hillary Clinton over her necessary vote. So there's also a documentary that came out on Amazon Prime this week. This is talking about the techniques in harvesting data from fundamentalist churches. And they've gone to a next phase, which is once they tap out the likely voters in the fundamentalist churches, they're trying to pull more people into the fundamentalist communities in order to activate them as voters. So what they're doing is going after available data. Some of it is, most of it is legal. But some of it is a matter of accessing mental health data, which presents very grave questions in terms of HIPAA regulation and mental health privacy. They are looking for people who are going through divorce, who are experiencing depression, who have mental illness ranging from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder, substance abuse issues, and they pull them into these church organizations and then use these vulnerable people as part of their political operations, not just for their votes, but to disseminate a lot of their online activity. And again, I have to say that every political party, at this point, every political organization uses data and will send messaging to specific audiences based on the data that they have on them, in the same way that Abraham Lincoln tells his Gettysburg audience a message that is tailored to their concerns about the war. So that part's not new. But this highly targeted population, this use of data to work directly with turning fundamentalist churches into political organizations in a very activist way, in defiance of tax regulations. I think, at least within the context of US history, this is new and troubling. I will say that this whole operation has been tried out in other countries. And so if you look at the documentary, The Great Hack, they'll show how Cambridge Analytica pioneered a lot of its data operations in elections in the Caribbean and in African countries, so that they could really hone their technique. And then their big coming out party was the Brexit campaign in Great Britain, where they targeted older, white, low information voters and really blanketed them with information that suggested that armies of Turks would be invading the UK and that voting out Brexit would improve funding for the National Health Service, which was not true. So it was really debuted in the UK on a massive and successful level. 2016 was another example of it being used here. One of the major actors in this innovation is, interestingly enough, Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is a very digitally savvy politician. Turns out his mother was a computer scientist. And so he jumped onto this whole style of campaign operations early on and allowed it to pivot to Donald Trump because it was going to benefit the overall movement. And I just want to reiterate that these people have long-term goals. One of them is the control of the federal judiciary, so that in the long term, it won't matter what the plurality of the popular vote will be in the least, because if you have voter suppression measures that are approved, if you have gerrymandering measures that are approved, you can manipulate the electoral system ad infinitum. So that plus control of the Senate allows a system of government that has less and less to do with the popular will. So amidst all of this, we've got several questions. There's a lot of attention that is focused on swing voters. And you'll see that here in 2016, it was really quite a close race between Clinton in the blue and Trump in the red, within one point. But you've got swing voters, third-party voters, and then you have this great big gray area, which is the people who did not vote. And activating the people who are registered but didn't vote, and then the green area, people who are eligible to vote but they haven't registered. That is a huge factor in this, and we don't know how it's going to play out. In the meantime, we've got this whole operation moving into the COVID forum in a way that is very concerning. As I mentioned, the Trump campaign decided early on that they needed public rallies, they needed canvassing, and they needed the economy reopened in order to run a strong campaign. And in this summer, there was a conference call between the leadership of the Council for National Policy and the Trump campaign, where they said, Americans are frightened of COVID. We need to send messages that will reassure them so that we can have our rallies and our economy reopened. And somebody on the call said, I've got some doctors who support us. And they organized a group of doctors who called themselves America's Frontline Doctors, who put out a message that said, hydroxychloroquine is a cure for COVID. This is not true. They also said it's a prophylactic, which prevents COVID. This is not true. There was some uncertainty about hydroxychloroquine 6 months ago. There's been a lot of research that has settled that uncertainty. It is not a cure. And in fact, hydroxychloroquine can aggravate cardiac issues. And so you can have people who don't have COVID, who take hydroxychloroquine, who can have grave health crises or death as a result of taking this medication. The other problem is that it is the medication that is indicated for severe autoimmune diseases like lupus. So this whole campaign, which was unleashed in July, has caused a medical crisis in itself on many fronts. As it happens, the doctor who's led the charge, Simone Gold, shown here, claims that she's been a COVID doctor who has experienced this in the emergency rooms, but her own credentials are very mysterious. It's not been possible to find out where she's actually practiced in these emergency rooms. And of the white-coated doctors behind her backing up her claims, one of them is a child psychiatrist, another is an ophthalmologist. So there are various people where there's no record of them having treated COVID-19, and there's no reason that they particularly would have, given their specialty. But this press conference was held in front of the Supreme Court. It was live streamed by Breitbart, reaching something like 16 million people the same day. It was tweeted by Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr., which reached more millions. And now it's played out against these various media platforms where it has had a kind of multiple effect. First of all, saying that you don't have to be afraid of COVID because there's a cure, which there is not. Second of all, that after the original press conference was broadcast, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter all took it down the same day as misinformation, which led them to say, oh, there's a conspiracy by big tech to deprive you of the cure for COVID. So big tech is all against you. And there's a conspiracy by your family doctor and the CDC to deprive you of the cure. So you shouldn't, again, going back to my initial comment, the architecture of knowledge, medical research, universities, academic study, fact-finding, journalism, all are being discredited. And this population is being manipulated into feeling that they can't trust anyone or anything. So here you have Fox News attacking big tech for cracking down on this miracle cure. Here you've got Breitbart, except it's not just Breitbart. It's on the Christian Broadcasting News. You see the logo in the lower left-hand corner. That's Pat Robertson's network. So that reaches all of these fundamentalist churchgoers across the Midwest. And again, not only are they saying hydroxychloroquine is a cure, they're also sowing doubt against everyone who is challenging it on a scientific basis. The Charlie Kirk show. Charlie Kirk is the Council for National Policy member who's in charge of going after the youth. And here they are attacking Dr. Fauci, attacking the medical deep state and the CDC, and promoting America's frontline doctors as the experts on COVID-19 and hydroxychloroquine. So all of this was unfolding over July and August and into September. I wrote an article about it for the Washington Spectator. And lo and behold, you also have a spike in a lot of these states that's still rising in cases and deaths. So, okay, we'll go back to the election. We've got ratings that came out yesterday that suggest, based on recent polls, that Biden is in a favorable position in many of the swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There are still votes that are in question in North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona. This time around, the pollsters are being a lot more cautious because 2016 taught them the problems of their own methods. And what are they? Well, a lot of polling happens on the telephone, and it's hard to get telephone numbers. So if you're only getting landlines, that's not representative. There may be small samples. You may have people who don't tell you the truth or tell you that they're uncertain when their mind is made up. Or they may say they're likely voters, but they don't go vote. So this time they're saying, well, here's what the map looks like, but take absolutely nothing for granted. And if you looked at the map, this comes from the University of Virginia's Center for Politics, and an excellent website they have called The Crystal Ball. And what they would show yesterday on the Senate races is Democrat and leaning Democrat 49, same thing for Republicans. 2 seats are toss-ups, Iowa and North Carolina. So that's another situation to keep an eye on. So that's a wrap up of the research and some of the updates. And Mikhail promised me that you'd have lots of good questions. So I look forward to those. And thank you for your attention.
And thank you so much. That was, I don't know, I need a drink.
I know. We should have done this at cocktail hour, yes?
Yeah, no, truly. I mean, it's not that we don't know this, but to have it, give it to us in such detail is really, it's still very shocking. So I asked people to write their questions in the chat because last time I opened the discussion. I unmuted everybody. It didn't turn out so well. So please write your questions in chat, and maybe I'll start with a few things. I guess maybe, I think the big question for all of us is, can this be fought in democratic means, right? I mean, can illegal activity, big money, can this be fought in the way that Democrats and center left people have fought in the past, or do we need something new completely?
Well, I think that what we see right now, and probably for the last 20 years, is, the Democrats trying to play by the rules and getting bested by people who bring the gun to the knife fight, right? And I think you can go back to the Gore election and the whole question of the vote in Florida with the Chads. The historical record indicates that it looks quite likely that Gore won that election, but he didn't fight it because he decided at that point it would not be good for the country to create that dissension. And so you see at every juncture, every moment that one side decides to be the gentleman, the other side takes advantage and expands their footprint, right? Now, we can't undo digital campaign technology. Digital media is with us. And I don't think that the Democrats or the left should play dirty. I don't think they should break the law. But I do think they have to look at where this election battle for the future of the nation and the planet is actually being fought. And I was very interested to see just today that the organizations that work with the Council for National Policy, including the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, and the Susan B. Anthony list, which is anti-abortion, have been doing door-to-door canvassing for several months and reportedly hitting millions of households. And they've been doing it masked and distanced and in ways that don't seem to me to be much more dangerous than when I go to Trader Joe's, which I have to do to live, right? What's life without Trader Joe's? So as of today, the Democrats have announced, well, we're going to be doing canvassing too. And from everything I can tell, part of the Democrats' problem has been over-reliance on their technology. They love the shiny new toys, virtual reality and all of that. But what the research I've seen suggests that there's nothing more powerful than somebody coming up and looking you in the eye and asking you to vote for their candidate and leaving a piece of paper which tells you why, reminds you. That is said to be the gold standard of campaigning. And I would say, and I've heard interviews that suggest, that in the time of COVID, when people are feeling isolated and out of touch with other human beings, and having this, sympathetic person come and talk to them could be very powerful. So, I don't think that people should just rely on their, I think they need to get much more realistic. So for example, in 2016, Hillary Clinton's campaign disregarded radio. They said, oh, that's an old technology. It's an old technology, and a lot of older voters in swing states drive around in cars a lot with the radio on. So it's not a good idea to totally disregard the things that people actually use. Now, if I were king, which I will never be, I would say that we need a big thing, if we have the opportunity after the election, to revisit campaign finance and Citizens United. That has been a disaster for our political culture. We need to rethink the regulation on digital media. The idea has been, oh, digital media wants to be free, let them regulate themselves. Well, that's just left the door wide open for bad actors, from Russia to Iran to everybody else. And Americans are just being shamefully manipulated by this so-called freedom. You need to have it regulated in order not to do harm. And I think COVID is the perfect example of that. No, you don't make media free to kill people. That's not appropriate. So yes, that's how I look at it. That in the short term, there are a little over 30 days till the election, and then there's going to be a whole other media crisis about the results of the election that will have to be addressed by whatever means. And then there's going to be a need for a big sit down at the drawing board and update our thinking about our political information culture.
And I guess my second question to you is about anti-Semitism. I mean, you showed that how the radical right uses Black Lives Matter. Is there also a greater use or a different use of anti-Semitic rhetoric at this time?
I would say that the racially tinged messaging is very front and center. I would say that you find the anti-Semitic information on the fringes. So, for example, when Trump in the debate referenced white supremacists and when Proud Boys were brought up, if you poke very far into those groups, you'll find them on Reddit, and you'll find them in connection with groups like the Stormer, which is overtly anti-Semitic, but I would not. It's somewhat more subtle than that. What you find in the Council for National Policy and its associates are a lot of people getting great prominence as Messianic Jews. So on the one hand, they play them hard as Jews, but the other hand, they're Messianic and they're fundamentalist. And so if you look at something like the Trump's Evangelical Advisory Council, Obama had an advisory council, people of faith, that included rabbis and Catholic priests and imams and so on. Nobody is on Trump's who is not a fundamentalist Protestant or Pentecostal or of that group. So I think it would be, I mean, it's hard for me to call something that is mostly tacit anti-Semitic, but it is not inclusive. And second of all, I think it's very deceptive. A lot of Jewish voters I hear about say that they could support Trump on the basis of his Israel policy. His Israel policy is driven by people like Mike Pompeo, who have publicly embraced the rapture, right? And the rapture as a concept, as a political concept, promotes conflict in the Middle East. And in my opinion, war and conflict are not good for Israel, right? And the rapture is not real. So that's like, after 3 years of living in their world, that's what I got.
Yeah, we actually have a question about that, about pro-Israel politics, I guess, of some of these fundamentalist groups and foreign policy in general and what role it plays.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I've taught for maybe over 15 years at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, and my whole career was in international affairs, and that's really been on the sidelines for this round, except for Israel. And for me, it's very much about Netanyahu. And it's about specific kinds of investments that have funneled from the fundamentalist organizations into Israel. And I was in Israel in September, and I was very struck by what form these investments take. They tend to not just avoid the Palestinians, they almost tend to spite the Palestinians. They tend to emphasize Israel as a fundamentalist theme park. So what I saw was a lot of Disneyfication of Israel for these enormous and frequent groups of fundamentalists who come on these tours and set up residence and The example that leapt out at me was the idea of the tramway around Jerusalem, where money and millions of dollars in investment were coming in to build a tramway that went around Jerusalem, making whistle stops at scenes of the New Testament, the Mount of Olives, Golgotha, etc. And not only did they disrupt in the construction, the Palestinian neighborhoods, they didn't even stop there and give them access to this public transportation. So it was looked at as a very kind of provocative way to spend billions of dollars. So you know, I look at Israel as somebody who's had just fantastic students over 20 years who are both Israelis and Palestinians, and just longing for them to be able to live their lives and their careers in a situation of peace and in a logical framework. And I don't see this policy contributing to that in the long term.
Other questions? People have asked about the DNC and what it's doing.
Oh, yeah.
And in a way you answer that. I don't know if you want to expand on that in terms of use of personal data, and you know, are they doing anything that's remotely close to what the other side is doing?
Yeah. So one of the issues, you know, is the way that data has been managed. And so the big idea, one of the big ideas for I360 and the Republicans' use of data through their partner platform, VoterVolt, was that they could share data across state lines, and it was heavily subsidized by the Koch brothers. So there would be local candidates and state level candidates who could purchase data gathered from these national platforms for a peppercorn, right? Like $100, and they could get this trove of data that they could use in their campaigns. For various reasons, the Democrats set their data operations up differently, so that it was a for-profit operation and it was not shared across state lines. It was more jealously guarded by different parts of the Democratic Party. So really, for those critical, 6 or 8 years, the availability of the data was greatly different. And in some ways, the Democrats even had better data in terms of collection, but it wasn't utilized or shared in anything like the same way. 2 weeks ago, the Democrats announced that they're setting up a broader data sharing operation. So they have basically 5 weeks to catch up with what the Republicans have been implementing for 5 years.
And could you, so somebody's asking, we have 2 questions. One is if you would say that in general, social media has had a bias towards the Republican Party's messages. Why have their messages reached more users than Democratic Party leaned messages? And the second is somebody's asking you to take a moment and share your thoughts about today's news about Trump and the pandemic, and which I don't know. I'm sort of thinking, is he going to use this to delay the election? Is this going to increase his popularity?
Well, I'll take the first one first. And I'm very pleased to see Gretchen Sanchez-Higuera here. So there's a very good article that came out, I believe it was a couple of days ago on Politico, that talked about the way that inflammatory, highly emotional messaging gets better traffic on social media, right? And I think that there's a real there's this problem in terms of matching political messaging with the audience. It's not new. Some of our participants may remember a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death that was about how television is a hotter medium that created more emotion than reading print. and how that had made a difference in our culture and our political life. Well, that also happens on social media. And so you've got something like Facebook, and I just want to refer you back to the 2016 debates, if you can remember it, where Trump was just loading the fire and the emotion and the rage, and he was a hot performer, right? And then Hillary Clinton came on with policy wonk talk, where even if you really cared about, health policy, which I do, it got so abstract that it was not an effective television performance. Okay, now move that over to your Facebook and your social media feeds. And think about how people who look at the feeds react. If something makes them angry, they're going to click. If something makes them emotional, they're more likely to click than if you give them a page of statistics. Hot, angry messaging, which tends to be more of the messaging of the Republicans. I'm not saying it has to be, and I'm not saying that the Democrats should replicate that, but it's a problem we really need to address. Now, today's news. Well, today's news, I mean, every day has been so full of news. Trump and Melania have COVID. My guess is that it will be very will probably further erode confidence in Trump. Now, I have to ask, given the proximity of the two candidates in the debate, what is the likelihood that Biden could have caught it as well? And for two men in their 70s, this is quite concerning. In terms of the polling I'm looking at, and this includes likely older voters in swing states, there are three overwhelming subjects for them. And again, it doesn't appear to be Black Lives Matter, and it doesn't appear to be the threat of crime. Number one is the danger of COVID. Number two is the economy and jobs. And number three is access to health care. So that's those are things that you saw Biden trying to play to emphatically in the debate. And it will now be on the Trump campaign to establish confidence in their handling of these problems. And you could hear various ideas and suggestions that there were plans to address them being floated in the debate, and beyond that in other areas of the campaign. So then it comes down to a really interesting question about the psychology of the authoritarian voter. And there's been some really interesting research on this. You have some voters who go back and do their homework and read all the position papers and read the journalism, and they're the nerds. We can recognize them in our classes, right? They do all their homework. There are others who just want somebody to tell them what to do. And they are sometimes from families with a strong patriarchal structure where the father says, this is what you do, don't ask me why, you just do it. You see it among a lot of populations that have been involved with the military. You see it a lot in fundamentalist churches, where there's this idea that there is a code that is an everlasting text, whether it's the Bible, whether it's a constitution, you take it extremely literally, right? Which leads to all kinds of contradictions and gymnastics, mental gymnastics, but they're looking for something to tell them what to do. And Trump has been very effective in messaging people who want the authority figure, do it because I say so, because I'm right, and because I am a forceful male patriarchal figure, and that's how I talk, that's how I present it. I'm not going to tell you the reasons why, because I'm right. And his chorus of supporters in the fundamentalist churches have really been playing this hard. You know, that is how they present him. And that is all of the messaging that's surrounding him. And so when you look at his debating, which is not debating, right? He's not taking on policy issues. He's not addressing points. He's still pounding away at the idea that he's the authority figure that people should follow, because he speaks more loudly than anyone else, and because he speaks with more certainty than anyone else. And I wish I could say that this were unique to the United States in 2020, but we see this approach and this problem replicated all over the world. And I almost wonder whether it is compounded by this incredible confusion and diffusion of social media, where people are bombarded by so much contradictory, garbage, chaotic messaging that they're just saying, I can't wade through this. Please just tell me what